The atmosphere on the Galilean hillside was not one of simple piety, but of deep, unsettled anticipation, 1,000 pairs of eyes fixed on the man seated calmly amidst the familiar, rugged landscape, his voice a steady, authoritative counterpoint to the nervous energy humming through the vast sun-drenched crowd. These were people tethered to a history that stretched back to fire and smoke on Sinai, bound by the covenant, the Torah, the law, and the prophets, a colossal, intricate structure of divine command that governed their every breath, their every ritual, their every social interaction. For them, the law was not just a guide, it was the sacred, non-negotiable definition of their identity, the very difference between the chosen and the world. And now this teacher, whose miracles were undeniable and whose compassion was legendary, was speaking of a kingdom that seemed to transcend, perhaps even threaten, the meticulously observed boundaries of that sacred code. Whispers of abolition, of revolutionary change were spreading, stirring anxiety among the devout and suspicion among the legal experts, the scribes and Pharisees, who guarded the law's letter with zealous fervor. Every pronouncement Jesus made, especially the revolutionary Beatitudes, blessing the poor, the meek, the peacemakers, sounded like an elegant, subversive critique of the established order, an order built on tangible, measurable obedience. It was to these doubts, these unvoiced fears, that he turned, his declaration cutting through the tension with the clarity of a trumpet call. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." This statement, simple in its structure, was a seismic shift in theological understanding, a redefinition that declared the law was not a static destination, but a dynamic, purposeful journey leading toward a singular, transcendent goal. He clarified that the law was not being nullified, but perfected, brought to its ultimate and intended conclusion, declaring with absolute certainty, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished." This was the affirmation of its eternal divine authority, assuring them that every minute detail, the smallest Hebrew letter, yod, the tiniest stroke, tittle, remained sacred and binding. But the method of that binding was about to change fundamentally, shifting from external pressure to internal transformation. From the letter that restricts to the spirit that empowers, the law's true purpose, Jesus revealed, was to act as a pedagogical instrument designed to stretch the human heart beyond simple compliance toward the impossible, radical standard of agape, or unconditional self-giving love. The law in its Mosaic form was a necessary vessel, but he had come to fill that vessel with the divine wine of perfected morality, demonstrating that the only way to truly obey the law was to live a life saturated in the principle that gave the law its existence, love itself, the very nature of God. He began the expansion with the most primal prohibition, the pillar of civilization. "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.'" A commandment so clear, so necessary, that no one would dare argue its validity. The old law dealt with the catastrophic act, the irreversible shedding of blood, and rightly prescribed judgment for the external transgression. But the fulfilled law plunged immediately into the hidden causality, the toxic wellspring from which all physical violence erupts. "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to the hell of fire." This declaration was terrifyingly comprehensive, demonstrating that murder was merely the final, gruesome expression of an initial spiritual sickness, unjustified anger and contempt. To call a brother raka, empty-headed, worthless, or more, fool, rebel against God, was to commit a spiritual act of murder, stripping him of his dignity, his inherent value as a bearer of the divine image, and wishing him non-existent. The fulfillment demanded that the violence be arrested, not at the moment of the hands rising, but at the very moment the thought of contempt takes root in the soul. Furthermore, he linked this internal purity directly to worship, commanding, "So, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. This revolutionary instruction prioritized horizontal relationship, reconciliation with a wounded neighbor, over vertical ritual, offering a sacrifice to God. The law was thus fulfilled when the state of one's heart toward one's neighbor became the highest form of worship, demonstrating that God desired love and mercy more than burnt offerings. The next expansion of the law turned its focus to the sanctity of relationship, addressing the seventh commandment. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery," a necessary decree for preserving the covenant of marriage and the integrity of the family unit, the foundational building block of society. The old law defined the sin by the external observed action. The fulfilled law, however, penetrated the secret chambers of human thought, demanding a standard of purity previously unheard of. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. This was the law's completion, shifting the moral battlefield from the external arena of bodies to the internal realm of the will and desire. He taught that the law was not a mere hedge against scandal, but a call to absolute internal fidelity. The true violation of the covenant occurred not when the physical act was consummated, but the instant a person reduced another soul, created in God's image, to a mere object of selfish, uncontrolled appetite. The moral calculus demanded not just abstinence from the deed, but the purification of the gaze, the control of the imagination. And such was the gravity of this interior offense that he used hyperbolic, shocking language to convey its danger. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. A vivid metaphor, emphasizing the need for ruthless self-discipline over the inner life, demonstrating that fulfilling the law meant being willing to sacrifice everything, even one's most prized faculties, rather than entertain the thought that leads to the destruction of both the self and others. The law's fulfillment required a constant, vigilant commitment to see the dignity of the soul before the allure of the form. Following this, he addressed the complex, often manipulated laws concerning oaths and promises, which were initially designed to ensure absolute truthfulness and the sacredness of one's word. Again you have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn." The problem was that legalistic minds had developed a casuistry of oaths, distinguishing between those sworn by the temple, those sworn by the gold of the temple, those sworn by heaven or by one's head, thereby creating a hierarchy of commitment, where a person could tell a near lie or make a disposable promise by choosing a less binding oath. This system of clever semantic avoidance had ultimately degraded the very concept of truth in daily discourse. The law's fulfillment annihilated this system of calculated ambiguity and loophole exploitation. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is his footstool. Let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. This was the demand for radical transparency and absolute integrity of character. The law was fulfilled when the speaker's word required no additional external authentication, no appeal to sacred objects or divine witnesses, because the person's inner character was so entirely fused with truth that his simple yes or no carried the full weight of the universe. The external law requiring a formal oath was fulfilled by the internal, continuous practice of living in congruence with reality, making the act of speaking the truth a constant, seamless act of worship. He continued his systematic elevation, addressing the civil law of divorce, which, though permitted by Moses due to the hardness of your hearts, represented a compromise with human frailty and a failure to maintain the original, perfect ideal of the marital union. The law allowed a man to give his wife a certificate of divorce if he found some indecency in her, a provision that had become grossly abused, allowing men to dismiss wives for trivialities like poor cooking or failing to bear a son, leaving the woman economically and socially vulnerable. The law's partial permission was a concession to a fallen world. The fulfillment, however, reached back to the moment of creation. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. By returning the standard to the original creative intent, that two shall become one flesh, Jesus fulfilled the law by affirming the covenant's absolute sacredness and permanence, thereby protecting the vulnerable party, the woman, from the capricious power of the man. The fulfillment here was not an addition of rules, but a return to the perfect, uncompromised spirit of the original divine institution, demanding mutual respect, fidelity, and permanence over the casual transaction of convenient separation. The instruction that followed, the command to transcend the lex talionis, was the most profoundly challenging and countercultural, striking at the very core of human justice. "You have heard that it was said, 'An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth,'" he repeated, acknowledging the law's essential function as a legal limit on vengeance, ensuring a crime was met with only proportionate equivalent injury, thereby preventing vendettas from spiraling into clan annihilation. But the law's fulfillment demanded an entirely new calculus of response, one that abolished the very necessity of equivalent return. "But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. This was not a call to surrender or cowardice. It was a command for redemptive resistance through non-cooperation with the cycle of evil. The slap on the right cheek, usually delivered with the back of the hand, was an act of contempt designed to assert dominance over a perceived inferior. By offering the other cheek, the victim simultaneously exposed the aggressor's brutality and subverted his power, forcing him to strike with a closed fist, an act reserved for equals, which was riskier, or back down in confusion. The law was fulfilled when the soul refused to be defined by the injury it suffered, choosing instead to actively inject love and grace into the moment of violation, thereby breaking the destructive chain and seeking the aggressor's redemption rather than his punishment. The ultimate law of justice was fulfilled by the ultimate law of mercy. This led to the final, transcendent summation, the zenith of the fulfilled law. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.'" This reflected the limited, tribal interpretation of the law, where neighbor was understood to mean a fellow member of the covenant community, and hatred for enemies, the oppressors, the wicked, the outside world, was considered a righteous act of separation. The fulfilled law expanded the field of love to include the entire human spectrum. "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven." This was the essence of perfection, the mirror of the divine nature. The law was fulfilled when human love became impartial, mirroring God's own grace that sends rain and sunlight upon the just and the unjust, the righteous and the wicked without discrimination. This standard, the love of the enemy, was the single most difficult, most divine command, demanding a complete obliteration of the ego's desire for self-defense and vengeance, replacing it with an unconditional commitment to the enemy's highest good. The law's journey culminated not in a list of tasks accomplished, but in the total spiritual transformation of the human being into a vessel of God's own boundless, perfect love. "You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." To truly grasp the radical weight of this fulfillment, one must witness its crucible in the human soul. Consider the story of Rabbi Shimon ben Zakkai, a fictionalized figure representing the highest order of the legalistic mind, whose life was a monument to the unfulfilled law, the external observance. Shimon spent his life in the endless pursuit of ritual purity, his garments spotless, his hands perpetually washed, his tithes flawless, yet his heart was a desert of judgment, divided into the clean and the unclean, the worthy and the unworthy. He despised the Roman occupiers, of course, but he held an even colder contempt for the am haaretz, the common, ignorant people who failed to keep the law as meticulously as he did, and he viewed the tax collectors, the publicans, as the ultimate spiritual filth, betrayers of the nation and covenant. His righteousness was a wall built to keep the filth out, and he believed this wall was the fulfillment of God's command. One day his daughter, a simple, gentle girl named Leah, was gravely injured by a runaway cart driven by a publican named Marcus, a Jewish collaborator whose job was the collection of Roman tariffs. a man Shimon believed was eternally damned. Leah's injury was severe, requiring a healer, and the only physician skilled enough in the region was a Samaritan, a half-breed, a man considered ritually and theologically defiled, whom Shimon was forbidden by the law to invite into his house or even speak to beyond the bare necessities. Shimon was trapped in a paradox. The life of his beloved daughter depended on the assistance of two men his entire life's practice had trained him to despise, to curse, to hate. His rigid adherence to the law, the prohibitions against mixing with tax collectors and Samaritans, was now the direct, agonizing cause of his daughter's potential death. The external law demanded purity and separation. The internal, fulfilled law demanded love and connection. Shimon, in his torment, stood outside his home tearing at his robes, screaming not at God, but at the law he had so slavishly served, realizing that the law had become a weapon of separation, a cold, inert barrier instead of the living path to God. It was then, in his total breakdown, that the words from the hillside returned, not as a command to break the law but to fulfill it. He realized that the commandment to love his neighbor, the greatest commandment, was the law's iota, the tiny dot that, when fully understood, transformed the entire scroll. The law against murder meant he could not wish Marcus harm, even as the instrument of his pain. The law of love meant he had to cross the line of ritual purity to seek the Samaritan doctor's aid. The law's fulfillment required him to collapse his external wall of purity for the sake of an internal act of mercy. In a moment of agonizing submission, Shimon did the unthinkable. He ordered his servants to bring Marcus the publican, who was weeping nearby, shattered by the accident, and he instructed them to bring the Samaritan healer, offering his own home, his own sacred space. To these two men he had once considered dogs. He did not offer them food or drink, lest he violate the ritual laws he still held sacred, but he offered them the one thing the law in its unfulfilled state forbade: unconditional acceptance as human beings, as neighbors, as agents of divine mercy. He stood by Marcus, not to accuse him, but to comfort him, acknowledging their shared status as broken men in need of grace. He served the Samaritan healer, wiping sweat from his brow, fulfilling the law's demand for the highest act of service, the preservation of life, by transcending the law's prohibition against contamination. In that single profound act of radical love, Rabbi Shimon ben Zakkai did not abolish the Torah. He fulfilled every single word of it, demonstrating that the law's ultimate destination was always the limitless expanse of the human heart, purified by agape. He learned that true righteousness was not in the rigid exclusion of the impure, but in the self-sacrificial inclusion of all, making the law whole and glorious in the light of perfect love. This, then, is the magnificent, challenging truth of the fulfilled law, which asks not for a transactional obedience, but for a total transformative conversion of the soul. If you love this story and want to hear more like it, please hit that subscribe button. It truly means the world to us and helps us grow. And hey, while you're at it, let's aim for 50 likes on this video. Help us smash that goal.